Welcome back. In the last video, I went through identifying and describing the coordinated structures in our scholarly sentence. It turned out that my first potential structure, the smallest possible one, was thwarted by a comma. I ended up looking back into the sentence and seeing the list-like structure that is ultimately coordinated by that coordinator and. I left off, however, before identifying the word or words that would help me confirm that I've got the coordinated structures correctly identified. The words I'm talking about are the ones that we can repeat at the beginning of each coordinated phrase or clause or other structure. In our case, it seems to be the word of. And in fact, if I repeat the word in front of each structure, then I can listen a little and see and hear if it makes grammatical sense. Of active materials that absorb and release lithium ions. Of carbon particles that provide electrical conductivity. And of a polymeric binder that maintains structural integrity. Oh, and I do note that I said polymetric instead of polymeric in the last video, and I'm not going to go back and correct it since it's not crucial to understanding the grammar here. I might actually be a little lazy too. Anyhow, each of the prepositions of fits in front of the phrases nicely. Now, one thing that sometimes happens is that your ear may need a little help, or you may need to see a slightly larger structure at the beginning of the coordinated structure. For example, I could have taken the phrase a mixture of as the head and repeated that. Here we go, consisting of a mixture of active materials that absorb and release lithium ions, a mixture of carbon particles, etc., etc. Here's another way to look at it in case you need to spread things out in your bullet point fashion to fully see the parallel structures at play here. So there you have the parallelism, the coordination identified. As I said in the last video, this larger coordinated structure, just look at the length of the structures, sure feel like it's not something that we may call personal, or better yet, may be indicative of academic or scholarly work. Some have noted already that the parallelism they use in their very personal descriptions is much shorter. Now, I'd like to move past the parallelism to the nature of the clauses. You'll remember, hopefully, that we identified 6 verbs in this sentence, which means 6 potential places for clauses. So let's go through them. The first verb are is. Wait, did I just say that? Are is? Yes, I did. I love it when that happens. Anyway, the first verb are is a finite verb because it has a definite tense, present, and is not the infinitive to be, nor does it have the 2 other forms that are non-finite, being or been. It is just are, present tense. The second verb consisting sure feels like a non-finite verb since it does carry the ing ending. The rest of the verbs are all present tense, which means they are likely candidates for finite clauses, and they are definitely finite verbs. One side note, the 2 verbs absorb and release I'm going to treat as a single verb for our clause purposes, since this is one of those parallel structures that is very small. I'll say the coordinated structures out loud to demonstrate. Active materials that absorb lithium ions. Active materials that release lithium ions. Okay? Okay. So we really have 5 different places that might be clauses. So let's test. The first verb are would need a complementizer in front of it to turn it into a clause. And when I look at the sentence again, I see that this first verb is a main clause. The subject is electrodes right up here, a noun followed by a prepositional phrase, and it matches the verb are. Electrodes are. A subject and then a predicate. This is the main sentence and not an embedded or subordinate clause because it stands on its own. The next verb, consisting, I figure is likely non-finite because of its ending, the ing. And in fact, if I read just the clause up to where I suspect the next clause begins, then I get this, consisting of a mixture of active materials. Say that again, consisting of a mixture of active materials. That does not sound like a complete sentence, and it's not since I can't find a corresponding subject for it. It's not, for instance, is consisting of a mixture, which would presume some subject ahead of it. Instead, we have a clause, a non-finite one with the ing verbal ending. For the third verb, and we can then duplicate this for the rest of the clauses because of the parallelism we discussed earlier, we have the word that, a complementizer that precedes each verb. Picture perfect finite clause. This complementizer verb pattern is common, especially when the clause acts as an adjective or is adjectival. As a bonus here, we can test this clause just like we test a single adjective. For example, testing the one found in the noun phrase lithium-ion batteries above, we can ask which one, what kind. In other words, what kind of batteries? Well, lithium-ion ones, of course. Which active materials? Well, the ones that absorb and release lithium ions, of course. What kind of carbon particles? Those that provide electrical conductivity, of course, you get the idea. That covers the function of those clauses. Notice, too, that I can apply the same test here that I did to the non-finite clause above. If I read this clause, that absorb and release lithium ions, it sounds incomplete. It can't stand on its own. If I walk up to you and say, that absorb and release lithium ions, you'd ask me what the hell I'm talking about. Okay, so this sentence has both kinds of clauses, non-finite and finite, and it turns out that the finite clauses are tied as well to that parallelism discussed earlier. I'll leave it to you to decide if the clause length and perhaps the clause function, adjectival in this case, is found in this configuration in your personal or other not-so-scholarly writing. As a final note, I'd like to end on a question, something to propel us into the next video. So here it is. Is the main sentence, the one with the subject electrodes, is this in passive voice or not? I'll cover that later.